Today we're going to talk about Joseph Smith running for the presidency of the United States. Now, in the past, we know we've talked about Joseph Smith as a prophet of God. We know we've also talked about Joseph Smith as the mayor of Nauvoo. He's been the lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion. He's a community builder, and there's so many things to say about the prophet Joseph Smith. But in this presentation, we're strictly going to talk about Joseph Smith as he makes the decision to run for the presidency of the United States. The big question is, one, why? And if he had lived, did he have a chance really to be president? And what would he have done if he had been elected president of these United States? So the year we're starting out in is the year 1843, 1844. In that year, there were 26 states in the United States. You'd say of those states, by far, you'd say, what's the border of the United States? We've actually made it out to the Mississippi River. So if you were to look at where are those 26 states located, you'd just draw a line up the Mississippi River and you'd say everything east of that is part of the United States. Now, we do have one territory, which is Iowa. Now, of those states, we know that there were several political parties that people in the United States could belong to. But the two dominant parties at that time were the Democratic Party and the Whig Party, with the Whig Party being a precursor to what we know today as the Republican Party. If we were to look at those that were Latter-day Saints, at that time in our nation, only men could vote, and they needed to be free men. Now, of the men that could vote that were Latter-day Saints, in the past, if we were to look at our history, we would say in Ohio and even in Missouri, we are voting for those in the Democratic Party. But obviously then the year 1843-44, when the election will occur, the plan was not to vote for a Democrat, not to vote for a Whig, but to vote for Joseph Smith, who was running in a separate party. Now, the main issues that were being addressed at that time, one was manifest destiny. Although the United States had pushed itself to the Mississippi River, there was much talk of manifest destiny, meaning the United States was really meant to go from sea to shining sea, which meant it would go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. There were even some in the United States that were talking about the United States was a little stone that was cut out of the hill that it would roll forth and fill the entire world. And you'd say, what are they talking about? You'd say it's Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel's interpretation. So there was much talk in the United States about manifest destiny, that we were really meant to go from sea to shining sea. Another issue that was being talked about by political hopefuls was, well, if we're going from sea to shining sea, what should we annex first? And the thought was Texas. Well, Texas at that point was owned by the Mexican government. And so even though you've got political leaders that control that nation and claim Texas as part of theirs, the United States candidates were talking about, we're going to go get it, and we're going first with manifest destiny to Texas. Another issue that was being considered in the 1840s was the issue of slavery. Now for this, we've got a division in the states right along the Mason-Dixon line. And for some, they are saying no slavery. Those were those that lived in the east, the north, above the line. For those in the South, they were saying yes, slavery, and that each state has its right to choose whether the Black Americans were slaves or not. Another issue that was just starting to come to the fore was the issue of the Latter-day Saints, which most in the nation called the Mormons. Now, by this point, the Latter-day Saints had been kicked out of the state of Missouri. And as it was kicked out, it was because of an extermination order issued by their governor, Lilburn W. Boggs. By 1843-44, we have a Democratic governor in Thomas Ford of Illinois that's obviously the governor over Nauvoo. For Thomas Ford, there's been a lot of talk about the Latter-day Saints, and even some rumors that the extermination order in Missouri might be reenacted in Illinois. So notice you've got some main issues to be discussed. One was then manifest destiny, another is slavery, yet another is the Latter-day Saints. For Joseph Smith, he's very concerned about who becomes president of these United States in the year 1844. As a result of Joseph's concern, he decided that he would write to those men who had thrown their hat into the political arena and announced their candidacy. Now, we've all had an occasion to see men, women who are running for president of these United States announce in advance before their party selects which ones to support, throw their hat in the political arena and say, "Choose me." Now, for the presidential hopefuls, in November 1843, you've got a man named Martin Van Buren. He's the one he's the one who's bald there. You got him? So, Martin Van Buren. Joseph has had an occasion of all the presidential hopefuls to meet Martin Van Buren. And after meeting Martin Van Buren, his comment was, "There's a lot of huffing and puffing in Washington, D.C., but not much goes on." Now, for Joseph Smith and Martin Van Buren, they have literally locked horns. Joseph has wanted Martin Van Buren to literally jump in the fray with the Saints and the state of Missouri, and Martin Van Buren has refused. So you've got one presidential hopeful that wants to run again as Martin Van Buren. Another is John C. Calhoun. He's a Southerner. He believes in states' rights. He believes in slavery. Others that are running, one is Henry Clay. He was a senator. It was said of Henry Clay that he was the best speaker that had ever served in the Senate. And yet another one, as time will pass, will be James K. Polk. That James K. Polk, he is an expansionist, and he wants not only Texas, but Oregon and perhaps even California. Now with this, Joseph now knows who the main ones are, and he is concerned, and he is very concerned about which of these main people that are running for the presidency of their party, the Democrats or Whigs, will support them. Joseph is very concerned about his vote. Now, obviously, we all care about our votes, but in this case, early pollsters, people who are starting to predict of the 26 states in the United States, it appeared to early pollsters that the election could go either way. It could go for the Democrats or it could go for the Whigs. And their conclusion, by all accounts, was the state that will really name the next president of the United States, whichever way the state of Illinois votes, that man will be president. Now, Joseph Smith, at this point, believes his vote really counts. He, as opposed to presidents of the church since then, but Joseph Smith would announce who he was voting for. Latter-day Saint men, for the most part, would fall in suit. Now, with that, Joseph believes that in this upcoming election, that he controls or has literally in his hands 20,000 votes. And with 20,000 votes, he can carry the state of Illinois, and he believes he can name the next president of these United States. So, believing himself having that kind of ballot box power, Joseph will now write to the various men who have thrown their hats in the political arena, such as John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay and others. And what he is writing is he has just one question for them. Notice what his question is. It is not about the monetary system in the United States. It is not about jail reform in the United States. It's not about manifest destiny, slavery, or any of the other kind of big issues that are there on the table to be considered. The one question that Joseph writes to each one of the candidates is he wants to know if the candidate were elected to be president of these United States, what would they do in their presidential power to get the people they call Mormons, meaning Latter-day Saints, their lands of inheritance back in Jackson County? Notice what Joseph is talking about. Lands of inheritance, we were there in 1831 through 1833. This is now 1843. It's 10 plus years later. And Joseph is still thinking Missouri. He's still thinking temples. He's still thinking this very promised land with so many opportunities that still await the saints. And so Joseph will write each one of the presidential candidates to ask, if you were named president and elected, what would you do to get the Latter-day Saints back, their lands in Jackson County, Missouri? Well, for some of the candidates, they did not respond. And I'm just going to say perhaps the mail carriers or mailman lost the letters. But two of the candidates did, John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. And both of them did the very political thing, which we've all had occasion to see, where they indicate, hey, this is a difficult decision. In other words, if I vote for you, saying I will do everything in my presidential powers to get the Latter-day Saints back their lands of inheritance, I will win the vote of Illinois, but I'm going to lose the vote of Missouri. If I said, hey, there's nothing I'm going to do to get you your lands back, lands of inheritance back, I would gain the vote of Missouri, but I'm going to lose that very important vote in Illinois. So both men do the very political thing, which says, once I'm president, I'll make a decision. Now, that way, they can get the votes of two states, Illinois and Missouri. Well, Joseph Smith is really put off by those that do not respond to his letter and his question, and he's put off by the response he receives from John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. We now come to 1844. It's January. Joseph, well, he's still a prophet of God. He's still the head of the Nauvoo Legion as a lieutenant general. He's the mayor of Nauvoo. And Joseph Smith calls an emergency meeting, and it's going to be our very first national political meeting ever held in Nauvoo. Now, where it will be held is in Joseph's red brick store. Notice, this store is one of 38 stores in town. Would I have shopped in other stores? Oh, sure. But that second story is the part we care about. On the second story of that building, we know that people received the endowment. There was sealing of couples. The Relief Society was organized. Book of Abraham written. The Articles of Faith. And in January 1844, the first national political meeting then of Joseph's soon-to-be candidacy was held. Attending that meeting, I would dare say probably none of us would have been there. Obviously, women can't vote, so they're out. And you'd say, who are the only ones invited to be at that meeting? You'd say members of the 12. You can look, you see Orson Pratt, Parley P. Pratt, Wilford Woodruff, Orson Hyde, Brigham Young, and you'd name the 12. You also get the presiding bishop. You get Hiram Smith. And the question to be debated was, what do we do about the election of 1844? People had a lot to say. Some said if we vote for the Democrats, they'll do nothing to get our lands of inheritance back. Others said if we vote for the Whigs, they'll do nothing. It was finally suggested, perhaps, well, let's just not vote. Let's just sit this out. But then there was a lot of talk of fathers, even some of the Latter-day Saints, having fought in the War of 1812, and their fathers, Joseph's grandfathers, having fought in the Revolutionary War. And that if we sat out the election, then it would look like we were not patriotic, and perhaps even Illinois, like Missouri, would feel the right they could issue some kind of extermination order. Finally, as they talk, it was suggested, well, perhaps we put up a dark horse candidate. In other words, someone we could vote for, but doesn't stand a chance to be elected president of these United States. So by doing that, we would show we were patriotic, because when we voted, and we voted for a man who would then, if elected president, would do everything in his power to get us back our lands in the state of Missouri. Of those there, it was a member of the Quorum of the 12, Willard Richards, that said, if I'm going to throw my vote away, in other words, I'm going to throw it away this year, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat or a Whig, I'm going to throw it away. He said there's only one man I know, if elected president of these United States, would do everything in his power to get me my lands of inheritance back in Jackson County. And he said, that man is General Joseph Smith. Now, notice when Joseph runs, he doesn't run as the prophet Joseph Smith, the mayor Joseph Smith. Every single kind of advertisement pushing forward who's running for office, it's always General Joseph Smith. Now, when Willard Richards announces that he is going to vote and he puts forth the name of Joseph Smith, the room erupts. Joseph accepts. Joseph comes outside. The men put Joseph on their shoulders. They walk through part of the town, and there's great excitement that General Joseph Smith will now run for president of these United States. Now, as we look at the ballots today, you'll see that there's always one man who runs for president, and there's always a second man that runs with him for vice president, no matter what the party is. In other words, one man is running, and you've got to have another man that will support him. Joseph now sends out a flurry of letters and sends to some important people in the United States asking, would you like to run as my vice presidential candidate? He sends it to a man in Tennessee, another man in New York, and so forth. And it's interesting, none of these letters appear to be lost. They all respond back saying, never associate my name with yours. In other words, I am not going to be your vice presidential candidate. Now, there is one exception, and the exception was Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon, at that time, it's such an interesting story. Sidney Rigdon actually had a house pretty close to Joseph's mansion house there in Nauvoo. But Sidney hadn't lived in it for a while. Sidney has moved from Nauvoo, and he is living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, you'd say on our books, he is in the first presidency of the church and voted as such. But you'd say for Sidney Rigdon, he is living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's attending his old Baptist church, and he's even preaching in his old Baptist church. So you'd say for Joseph, at one point when Sidney's name was brought up as a member of the First Presidency in a general conference, Joseph had said, I don't want Sidney, and the congregation voted that Sidney should remain in the presidency. Joseph says, you give me Sidney, I throw him back at you. Notice that Joseph didn't want Sidney in the First Presidency, but when it came to being vice president, oh, sure, who's a better speaker than Sidney Rigdon? I mean, maybe even Henry Clay might have had to take a back seat to Sidney Rigdon. Now, of those that Joseph invited to be his vice presidential candidate, Sidney Rigdon was the one who said yes. In that process, you look and you'd say, actually, it's a pretty good choice if you were to split up the states, because Joseph lives far, in the west, out there in Illinois, and Sidney Rigdon far towards the east, out there in Pennsylvania. You now have, as you begin to see advertisements, Joseph Smith, General Joseph Smith for president, and Sidney Rigdon of Pittsburgh for vice president. Now, a party will be formed, and the party is called the Reform Party. Notice there's not such a party today. It was a party that kind of came and went and has only a few months' duration. But if you're going to run for president, you need to have a platform which states what you will do if elected president of these United States. And for Joseph Smith, assisting him to write his platform will be W. Phelps, the man that wrote, "The Spirit of God like a fire is burning," and after the death of Joseph, praise to the man. So W. Phelps, who's talented, he's an editor, he's an amazing writer, he's a poet, he's just got talent that's so obvious. He now writes, with the permission of Joseph, the platform for the Reform Party and what Joseph would do if he were elected president of these United States. One of the first things, well, obviously, Joseph would get his people their lands back in Jackson County. But another thing that Joseph would do if elected president, he would reduce the pay of Congress. He'd even reduce the size of Congress. At that time, congressmen received about $2 a day. And for Joseph, when asked, well, why would you reduce their pay? His comment was, well, a farmer makes about $1 a day. And he said the difference between a farmer and a congressman is a farmer is honest. And so you have some really strong feelings that begin to come out as Joseph now looks at really what would he do if elected president. Joseph, like many of those running for the presidency, was an expansionist, where you get folks saying he'd like Texas and Oregon and perhaps California. For Joseph Smith, he wanted the whole northern hemisphere. And you'd look and you'd say, well, what are you talking about? And I go, well, there's Alaska, there's Canada, there's the United States, there's Mexico, you go Costa Rica, you're all the way down to Panama, right? And when asked, why would he be such an expansionist, he indicated that it's all Zion. In other words, I would bring Zion together. If he ran a second term, he was such an expansionist, he'd pull in the whole southern hemisphere. So we're talking about Brazil, Chile, Uruguay. You know, you begin to look at all that, and his comment was, it's Zion too. Never in the United States have we had any man running for president that's been the expansionist of manifest destiny, like General Joseph Smith. For Joseph, his plan, if elected president, he would eliminate slavery. So we're not talking Mason-Dixon line. We're not talking southern states, northern states. He would get rid of it completely. And how he would do it, I think, is pretty interesting. He said his plan is that the Southerners view their black slaves as property. He said he would buy their freedom from the slave owners, and he would buy it by giving them tracts of land. In other words, you think it's property, let me give you real land. Remember, he's the expansionist. And then he would give the former slaves a choice. One, at the expense of the United States, there would be ships and they could return to their homes back in Africa. Or two, they could stay in the United States and be free men. That was his plan. Another thing Joseph would do if elected president of these United States, he would standardize the monetary system. During Joseph's era, the monetary system was so confusing. You had paper money, and it was backed sometimes on hard metals such as gold and silver. But there would be different paper money in, say, Kirtland than would be in New York City, that would be in Michigan, and the list goes on. And so you had all of this kind of bogus, counterfeit paper money going everywhere that people were saying, oh, yes, this is legit. And Joseph's plan was, no, we're going to have a single standardized monetary system. And this monetary system would be backed by hard metal like gold and silver. And so a dollar, say in Ohio, would look the very same as a dollar in Illinois, as the very same as a dollar in Pennsylvania and New York, and so forth. So he was very big on a monetary system. For Joseph, he's had experience of being in jails. He knows something about what it's like to be arrested and incarcerated, and he knows the sheer boredom of being confined for hours on end. His determination went like this. In the United States at that time, they had debtors' cells. And if people bought something and then failed to pay their bill at some point when it was due, they could be subject and put into debtors' cells until their friends or family would pay the money for them. And so you'd say during this time you have between 60,000, 70,000 men that are incarcerated in jails for failure to be able to pay debts that they had accumulated, say, in a general store. There was also the issue of jail reform, that they're just sitting there. Joseph believed that jails should be institutes of learning and indicated that most people who are placed in prisons or incarcerated, that they are there because they have taken from society. Joseph's thought was that if they could be educated, then when they had served their time, they'd be able to get out of jail and then be able to contribute back to society rather than to take from. Well, he has lots of ideas, and how did it go? And kind of reviewing, we'd say in January, he's decided to run. By February, kind of towards the end, he's got everything in place. He's got Sidney Rigdon as his vice president living out there in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He's got W.W. Phelps that has helped to put together page after page of what would he do if elected president. And you'd say, is there any campaigning in January or February? And I'd say, no. Does it appear anybody outside of Nauvoo, greater Nauvoo area, knows he's running for president? And I go, no. Does he have any chance to win? Depends when you're talking about it. January, February, absolutely not. And then we come to March. So in March of now 1844, Joseph Smith receives a revelation in which he is told to organize a council. Now, there are lots of councils in the church: the Council of the First Presidency, Council of the 70, Council of the 12, and in this case, to organize a council called the Council of the 50. Now, the purpose of the Council of the 50 has everything to do with political affairs. One of the leaders of that council was Brigham Young. Brigham Young now went to the prophet Joseph in March of now 1844 and wanted to know, could I call political missionaries to further your campaign for president of these United States? Joseph Smith laughed. He goes, no. In other words, Brigham, you're too quick. It's not time. Remember, Christ, when he comes, is going to rule and reign as King of Kings, Lord of Lords. And, you're too quick on this. At which point, Brigham wanted to know, well, what if I called volunteers to push forward your political campaign for president of these United States? Joseph said yes, but he said he wanted to see the list when Brigham Young had a list of men that would go. Well, Brigham Young now spreads the word. Within just literally a few days, over 350 men have signed saying they'd like to be a volunteer to push forward Joseph Smith's ideas to be president of these United States. Joseph Smith now is shown the list by Brigham. As he's shown the list, all 12 members of the Quorum of the 12 volunteered to be political missionaries. They had been proselyting missionaries. They knew how to do it. And Joseph now looks over the list of 350 plus men, and his conclusion was, you can take everyone except for John Taylor and Willard Richards. Now, Willard Richards at that point was not only a member of the 12, but he was Joseph Smith's personal secretary. Joseph said of Willard Richards, I've been looking for you all my life. In other words, a good secretary is so hard to come by. And so Willard Richards, he wants Willard to stay close to him. The other man he wants close is John Taylor. John Taylor was the editor of 2 newspapers in town, the Times and Seasons and the Nauvoo Neighbor. And so the other 10 members, including Brigham, you can go out as political volunteers. Now, notice, during the 3 months that they are gone, the only 2 members of the 12 in Nauvoo with the prophet Joseph are John Taylor and Willard Richards. Notice how it's no surprise that who's with Joseph then in Carthage jail? Is it Brigham? Oh, no, it can't be. Brigham's out there serving a political mission. He's out in Boston with Wilford Woodruff. Is it Orson Pratt, Orson Hyde? And I go, no, they're in Washington, D.C. They are political volunteers. And so the only ones in town that could have been with Joseph there in the Carthage jail that were the 12, John Taylor and Willard Richards. Well, there weren't just 350 volunteers. We can identify over 1,200 men now leave Nauvoo. We know how organized the proselyting system of the church is. Try and imagine how organized then the political volunteers could have been. You send out 1,200. Well, just try and imagine having one volunteer like Wilford Woodruff on your campaign team. For any of you that ran for high school, college offices, Wilford Woodruff, 36 days after he'd been in England, he'd already baptized 600 people, including a constable that came to arrest him and 2 spies from the Church of England. Imagine these men, they're going to be knocking on doors. They know how to be turned away, but they also know how to get in. Suddenly, these men are, they found out through the United States, they're renting halls, they're holding rallies, and they begin to write letters to Joseph Smith, and they clip out of the newspaper, which newspapers were always the medium of communication. So they would clip out of the newspaper about a rally that's being held. As these men were holding rallies, the watch cry went like this: we've had Democratic presidents, we've had Whig presidents, but now it's finally time to have a president of these United States. And then they had a lot to talk about. They talked about expansionism. They talked about jail reform. Well, who hasn't had somebody in their family that's been stuck in one of those debtor's cells? And they talked about slavery and how they could prevent it as opposed to waiting about 20 years or so for a war. And there was a lot of discussion going on. As letters were coming back to Joseph, Joseph would take the letters and the little newspaper clipping, and he would hand them off to John Taylor and say, print this in the newspaper. Well, as the letters started coming forward, Joseph, he had a most unusual reaction. He goes, I'm popular. He knows how to be persecuted. He knows how to, wade through all the yuck of life, and suddenly goes, I'm popular. And then he's heard to say, I'm afraid I'm going to win. In other words, look who's out there pushing forward the campaign. And finally, he says there's enough speaking ability out there with those political volunteers. I think I'll win on the first electoral ballot. In other words, Joseph is becoming more and more confident that he will win. Rallies are being held in which you'd say there's a few hundred, there's 5,000 attending. And they're always saying, we've had a Whig president, we've had a Democratic president. It's now time to have a president of these United States. Well, not everyone is pleased. We remember William Law and the Nauvoo expositor, meaning we're going to expose Joseph Smith for what they saw him as and to expose the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for what he saw that as. And we know that several things conspired until finally we have the death of Joseph. So June 27th, 1844, those political missionaries have had about 3 months to talk to people about Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith died June 27th, 1844. His brother Hiram died also. You'd say for John Taylor, Willard Richards, they're there with him in the jail. Time will pass, and in the meantime, those political missionaries still think that Joseph Smith is alive and he will be president. You finally get newspapers from Nauvoo. The clippings are being picked up by other newspapers, and Orson Pratt has seen one in Washington, and he takes that paper and he goes to find Brigham Young. And when he finds Brigham Young in the greater Boston area, Orson is telling him Joseph's dead, and Brigham is confident he can't be dead. In other words, he's going to be the next president. We've had the following. And Orson Pratt says, you look me in the eye, you tell me he's not dead. Well, the sorrow that enveloped, not only the members of the 12, all political volunteers who now come home, the sorrow that draped Nauvoo. I mean, even back east where there had been political missionaries, Latter-day Saints and others will wear black armbands to remember then the death of someone running for president of these United States. In Nauvoo, everything went silent. Schools were closed. People literally thought that Mormonism was no more. In other words, the church was no more. Their leader was gone. So you'd say Joseph then was shot while running for president of these United States. Who's the next political figure in the United States who was a viable candidate for president of the United States? And it's John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert, that is shot while running for president of these United States. Now, as the elections will now go forward, I thought you'd enjoy seeing how it all turned out. Here's your map. You're looking at the blue and the yellow. You can see the electoral vote. You've got finally the two main candidates running in 1844 for President of the United States. You've got James K. Polk, a Democrat. He's, recall, your expansionist that wants Texas, Oregon, and eventually will declare war with Mexico and trying to fulfill this manifest destiny. He will beat out Henry Clay, the great speaker who ran for the Whig Party. As you look at the electoral vote, you can see that blue wins, in other words, kind of purple, and those are your Democratic states and how they will go. Even Illinois, you can see, goes Democrat. But if you were to look at the popular vote, you can see how very, very close it was at that time. Could Joseph have been president? Well, I don't know if we'll ever know. As James K. Polk took over that presidency, we do know that under his direction, we have something called the Mormon Battalion. And many Latter-day Saints who have pioneer heritage can look at that Mormon Battalion and realize the long march that they made heading out from the Council Bluffs area as they marched in the effort to bring about manifest destiny. Well, in conclusion, I hope you've learned a lot today. I hope you've learned that Joseph Smith was obviously a multifaceted man. He was the Lord's choice. He was a prophet of God. He is the man that literally through him we get temple work, we get the Book of Mormon. I mean, the list goes on and on. But Joseph also ran for president of these United States. If I could have voted back then, would I have voted for him? Oh, sure. I hope you would have too. I'd like to close with my testimony. I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. I am so grateful for the hours I've spent in my life learning about his life. I am grateful for his willingness to stand up for what he believes and even to put forth much of that belief into the church, as well as a political platform that shows what he would have done in the United States to make it a perhaps a more happier, comfortable, kinder society. And I say this humbly in Jesus' name. Amen.